I knew the exact moment my career at Arenix Systems was dead. It wasn't when the CEO yelled, "Get out!" That moment was loud, public, easy to point to. But careers rarely end in moments like that. They end earlier, quietly, in rooms where no one raises their voice and everyone pretends they're aligned. For me, it ended months before. The day Daniel Reeves walked through the glass doors, convinced the story mattered more than the truth. At the time, no one else noticed. I did. I don't look like the kind of person people imagine when they think of founders. I don't speak in sound bites. I don't frame my work as destiny. I build systems. And systems don't care about confidence. They care about precision. I built the engine behind Arenix, not as a side project, not as a team exercise, as a long, uninterrupted stretch of work that required patience more than visibility, years of testing, failing quietly, correcting errors small enough to never appear in slide decks, the kind of work that doesn't photograph well. Back then, the office was smaller, quieter. We had fewer meetings and more whiteboards that stayed erased for days at a time. When something broke, no one asked who to blame. We asked where the assumption failed. That was the culture, until it wasn't. Daniel arrived with certainty, the kind that walks faster than everyone else and calls it momentum. He talked about scale, about exits, about how the market needed a cleaner narrative. He used words like clarity and focus while gesturing at things he hadn't taken the time to understand. He wasn't hostile, not at first. He was friendly in the way people are when they believe they're being generous, when they assume resistance comes from ignorance, not principle. "Complexity scares money," he said once, smiling like it was advice. I didn't argue. I looked at the diagram on the screen and waited for him to finish. The system didn't scare me. It demanded respect. I didn't lose my position overnight. No one fired me. No one confronted me. I was erased in increments. First, my name disappeared from internal updates. Then meetings moved to times I wasn't available. Decisions were made in rooms I wasn't invited into. People I had mentored stopped making eye contact in the hallway, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. This is how organizations avoid accountability. They don't attack, they reframe. Suddenly, I wasn't essential. I was legacy, a word that sounds respectful until you realize it means in the way. I noticed the shift long before it became obvious. When you build something from the inside, you feel imbalanced the way engineers feel vibration in a bridge before anyone else hears the crack. What Daniel didn't understand, what he never bothered to ask, was that Arenix didn't own the engine. They licensed it. I kept the core rights, quietly, deliberately, long before he arrived, not as a threat, as a boundary. Most people stop reading contracts once they believe they're in control. That's the blind spot. The first real mistake wasn't personal. It was procedural. A document, a deck, prepared for outside eyes. Language matters in those moments. Every word becomes a claim. When I saw the phrase wholly owned proprietary technology printed in confident black type, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. That wasn't branding. That was a breach. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't warn Daniel. I didn't raise the issue in a meeting and give him a chance to correct himself quietly. I waited. Power reveals itself most honestly when it believes it's safe. By the time Daniel yelled, "Get out," everything he needed to say had already been said, out loud, on record, in front of witnesses. The irony is that he told me to read my contract. I had, years earlier. I walked out without making a scene, not because I was defeated, but because the moment didn't require performance. Silence, when used correctly, is not absence. It's preparation. What followed wasn't dramatic. No instant collapse, no headlines, just a clock starting its quiet countdown. 24 hours. People assume stories like this are about revenge. They're not. They're about misunderstanding where control actually lives. Daniel thought power was the room, the board, the voice that spoke the loudest. He never noticed the system humming steadily in the background, never asked who maintained it, never questioned the fine print because confidence told him it was unnecessary. That's what happens when authority stops listening to structure. The system doesn't rebel. It simply stops cooperating. This isn't a story about shouting back. It's about what remains when the noise ends. and how quietly things fall apart when the people in charge never understood what they were holding. Daniel Reeves didn't arrive like a disruption. He arrived like a solution. That's how he was introduced to the room. The board called it a transition. HR called it alignment. The internal memo used the word accelerate 3 times in the first paragraph and never once mentioned the product. People smiled. People nodded. People repeated his phrases as if they had always believed them. Daniel spoke easily. He didn't rush. He had the posture of someone who'd never had to explain himself twice. He didn't ask how the system worked. He asked how fast it could grow. That distinction mattered. At first, it was subtle. A change in language, a different kind of meeting. Slides replaced whiteboards. Narratives replaced diagrams. He liked metaphors. He liked comparisons. He liked to say we were not just building technology, but a lifestyle layer. I remember sitting at the edge of the conference table the first time he said that, watching the reflection of the screen ripple across the glass walls. The system detected rare anomalies with near-perfect accuracy. It had taken years to reach that stability, years of restraint, of not over-promising. Complexity scares money, Daniel said again, this time to a room full of people who didn't build anything themselves. No one challenged him. I didn't either. I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in understanding how far he was willing to go without understanding what he was touching. Daniel didn't see the product as a system. He saw it as leverage. He talked about positioning, about exits, about how buyers wanted clarity, not caveats. He spoke as if uncertainty were a flaw instead of a reality. When I tried to explain the constraints, he smiled, the kind of smile that signals patience, not curiosity. "That's the engineer talking," he said once. "We need you to think bigger." I already was, just not in the direction he assumed. Over the next few weeks, Daniel made himself visible. He walked the floor, touched equipment, spoke to people without looking at them. He had a habit of finishing other people's sentences, usually incorrectly. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Authority, when it's backed by confidence and timing, doesn't shout, it reframes. The meetings multiplied. Strategy sessions, alignment calls, off-sites with catered lunches and vague objectives. The work didn't stop, but it became background noise to the performance of progress. I noticed how often Daniel spoke about the future and how rarely he referenced the present. That was the second signal. The first had been the language. The second was the distance. He stopped asking me questions, not because he knew the answers, but because he believed he no longer needed them. I was still there, still working, still maintaining the system that made every promise possible. But my role shifted. I became context, then legacy, then friction. Not in words anyone would admit to, in calendars, in email threads I wasn't copied on, in decisions made one layer above where technical reality lived. This is how organizations create blind spots. They elevate confidence and call it leadership. They mistake visibility for control. Daniel believed the company owned the story. He never asked who owned the engine. One afternoon, during a meeting about potential buyers, someone mentioned a number. A valuation so clean it felt fictional. Daniel smiled. "This is why we simplify," he said. "We give them something they can believe in." I looked at the slide. The diagram had been reduced to arrows and boxes. The recursive logic was gone. The constraints were gone. The risks were gone. So was the truth. I realized then that Daniel didn't see omission as deception. He saw it as efficiency. That's when I stopped trying to correct the record. Not because I was disengaging, because I was paying attention. People like Daniel don't make their biggest mistakes when they're challenged. They make them when they feel supported, when everyone in the room reflects their certainty back at them. I let that happen. I watched the language harden, watched claims become statements, watched assumptions become facts simply because they were repeated often enough. And all the while, the system kept running. Quiet, accurate, unimpressed. Daniel never noticed that it didn't belong to him. He assumed ownership the way confident people always do, as something that comes with the room. It didn't happen all at once. No announcement, no confrontation, no meeting where someone said my role was changing. That's not how erasure works in places like this. It starts with scheduling. Meetings get moved. Not canceled, just shifted to times you're already booked. You stop being the default attendee and become optional. Someone else presents work you recognize as your own, but simplified enough that no one asks questions. At first, I assumed it was temporary. Growth phases always create noise. New leadership reshuffles priorities. I told myself to stay focused on the system, to let the excitement burn itself out. But then my name disappeared. Not from the org chart. That would have been obvious. From the slide decks. Weekly updates went out without attribution. Diagrams I had designed were redrawn in different colors, stripped of annotations, explained by people who thought understanding meant repeating the summary out loud. I'd walk past conference rooms and see my work projected on the wall while Daniel spoke over it, translating complexity into confidence. No one corrected him. Why would they? The story sounded better that way. I noticed how often the phrase, "the team," replaced specific names, how ownership became collective when it was convenient and invisible when it wasn't. This is how organizations protect narratives. They blur authorship until responsibility dissolves. The shift wasn't hostile. That's what made it effective. People were still polite, still friendly in the hallway, but conversations ended when I approached. Slack threads went quiet. Decisions arrived pre-made. I was present but no longer central. And centrality, I was learning, had nothing to do with contribution. It had to do with alignment. One afternoon, I opened the shared calendar and saw a new recurring block labeled Private Strategy. It spanned half the week. No invite list, no agenda. I didn't ask about it. By then, I understood the rules of the game Daniel was playing. Questions create friction. Silence creates space. I started paying attention to what wasn't said. The junior engineers stopped asking for reviews. The product team began referencing timelines I'd never agreed to. Someone introduced a roadmap that assumed constraints had magically vanished. I recognized the pattern immediately. They weren't solving problems. They were routing around them. And I was the problem they were routing around. The phrase came later, but the meaning was already there. Legacy. It's a word executives use when they want to sound respectful while removing obstacles. It suggests gratitude without obligation, history without authority. I'd become part of the past in a company built on something that still depended on me. That contradiction didn't bother Daniel. It should have. What struck me most wasn't the exclusion. It was the confidence with which it happened, the assumption that systems are static, that once built, they no longer require the people who understand them. This belief is common, especially among people who arrive after the hard parts are done. They see the engine running and assume it always will. I kept working, not out of loyalty, out of discipline. The system needed maintenance, updates, careful calibration. It didn't respond well to neglect or shortcuts. I continued to do that work quietly, even as the company's attention drifted elsewhere. No one noticed. They were too busy preparing for what came next. I remember the moment it became undeniable. I was copied on an email by mistake, a thread between Daniel and the board discussing founder risk. The language was careful, sanitized, but clear enough. I wasn't a builder anymore. I was exposure. They weren't worried about whether the system worked. They were worried about whether I would complicate the story. That's when I stopped thinking in terms of belonging. I started thinking in terms of leverage. Not the loud kind, not threats or ultimatums. The structural kind. The kind that exists whether or not anyone acknowledges it. Daniel believed erasure was a management tactic, a way to ease transitions without conflict. He didn't realize it was also a signal that the people in charge had lost sight of where the real dependencies lived. You can sideline a person. You can't sideline an architecture. I didn't push back. I didn't defend my relevance. I didn't ask for recognition or clarification. I let the process continue, because by that point, I wasn't watching myself disappear. I was watching them build a story that required me to stay silent. And silence, when it's chosen deliberately, has weight. By the time they realized what they'd erased, it wouldn't be my name. It would be their margin for error. That's when I began to wait. The mistake wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. That's what made it irreversible. I didn't discover it in a confrontation or a meeting. It arrived the way most serious failures do, embedded in something routine, handled by someone who didn't understand what they were touching. A document meant for outside eyes. Due diligence materials. A deck prepared for potential buyers. Clean, polished, confident. Too confident. I was asked to review it late in the afternoon, framed as a formality. Just a quick look, a final pass before it went out. Nothing urgent. That alone told me something had shifted. When people stop asking how things work and start asking only how they look, the risk has already moved downstream. I opened the file and scrolled slowly. Architecture diagrams simplified into boxes, dependencies flattened into arrows, constraints reduced to footnotes no one would read. Then I saw the language. Not hidden, not subtle. Printed clearly without hesitation. Wholly owned proprietary technology. I didn't blink. I didn't feel anger or surprise. Those come from uncertainty. This felt like confirmation. That phrase wasn't marketing language. It wasn't aspirational. It was a claim. And claims, when made to third parties, carry weight. Under the agreement, Orenix had the right to use the system, to operate it, to integrate it into their workflows. They did not own it. Ownership was explicit, defined, non-transferable without consent. The difference wasn't semantic, it was structural. What I was looking at wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a breach. I read the slide again, then the next one, then the legal appendix. Everywhere the same assumption, repeated confidently enough to feel intentional. This wasn't an internal shortcut. This was a representation being made to people whose lawyers would take it seriously. I closed the file and sat there for a moment. The office was quiet. Late afternoon light slanted across the desks. Catching dust, no one bothered to clean anymore. Phones sat untouched. Chairs pushed back slightly, as if people had stepped away and forgotten to return. The system was running perfectly. That was the irony. They were preparing to sell something that depended on my continued cooperation, while simultaneously removing me from the structure that allowed it to function. I didn't alert anyone. I didn't correct the language or suggest edits. I didn't send a careful note flagging the issue and offering to help clean it up. That would have given them the opportunity to fix it quietly. I wasn't interested in that. Not because I wanted harm, but because I understood the difference between error and intent. This wasn't carelessness, it was assumption. The assumption that authority implies ownership. That control of the room extends to control of the system. I forwarded the file to my attorney from my personal email. No commentary, no explanation. Just the document. She replied less than 10 minutes later. Confirmed, she wrote. Material breach documented. That was all. There was no drama in that exchange. No celebration. Just acknowledgement. From that point on, the timeline no longer belonged to the company. It belonged to the contract. I went back to work. That's the part people don't expect. They imagine a moment like this as decisive, cinematic, a pivot. It wasn't. I finished what I was doing, closed my laptop, shut down my monitor, walked out of the building as if nothing had changed. Because nothing had. Not yet. The breach didn't trigger consequences immediately. It didn't announce itself. It didn't disrupt operations or send alarms through the system. It just existed, quiet, documented, waiting. That's how leverage works when it's grounded in structure instead of force. You don't need to threaten anyone. You let them continue. Every email sent after that point mattered. Every statement repeated the claim. Every meeting reinforced the assumption. They were building a case against themselves, and they didn't know it. By the time anyone questioned the language, it would no longer be a correction. It would be a record. That was when I stopped thinking about what they were doing to me. I started thinking about timing. Not when to act, but when not to. Waiting is usually framed as hesitation, indecision, fear, lack of courage. That's how people who rely on momentum talk about it. But waiting, when chosen deliberately, is none of those things. It's alignment. Once the breach was documented, nothing else needed to happen immediately. There was no advantage in reacting, no benefit in announcing what I knew. The system was still running. The deal was still moving forward. Daniel was still confident. That confidence was doing more work for me than any objection ever could. I stayed quiet, not withdrawn, not disengaged. Present, in the way people stop noticing when they believe you've already been neutralized. I attended the meetings I was invited to. I answered questions when they were asked. I corrected errors only when they threatened the system's stability, never when they threatened the narrative. There's a difference. Correcting the narrative would have slowed things down. Slowing things down would have made people curious. Curiosity is dangerous when you need someone to keep going. Daniel continued to speak in absolutes. Buyers want this. The market expects that. We can position it cleanly. Every statement built on the same untested assumption. Ownership. I listened carefully. The more certain he sounded, the more precise my timing needed to be. Waiting wasn't passive. It required discipline. The urge to speak, to clarify, to defend, to explain, comes from a desire to be seen as reasonable, to be understood. I had already learned that reasonableness wasn't currency in this environment. Confidence was, and Daniel had plenty of it. The days blurred into a strange calm. Emails went out announcing progress, legal milestones, preliminary approvals, internal celebrations that stopped just short of champagne. People congratulated each other in advance. No one congratulated me. That was fine. I had stopped measuring progress by visibility. I measured it by language. Each time the claim of ownership was repeated, the record deepened. Each time it went unchallenged, it hardened. I watched carefully for doubt. There wasn't any. The board trusted Daniel because he spoke their language. He translated uncertainty into optimism and called it leadership. They wanted a clean story. He gave them one. I wanted a clear record. I got that too. There was a moment, a few days in, when someone from legal asked a careful question, framed as curiosity, light, easily deflected. Daniel answered it without hesitation. "We're covered," he said. "The IP is ours." The room relaxed. That sentence did more damage than any document. I wrote it down afterward. Not the exact words, the moment. When certainty replaced caution, the waiting continued. I didn't mark time by the calendar. I marked it by accumulation. Statements, slides, emails, each one stacked neatly on top of the last. I knew what people expected from me. Resistance, emotion, a visible reaction they could point to later and describe as difficult. I gave them nothing. Silence is unsettling when it doesn't come from fear. People begin to fill it with assumptions. Daniel assumed I was contained, that the erasure had worked, that by removing my visibility, he had removed my influence. He didn't realize he had simplified the problem too much. The more he centralized authority, the fewer buffers remained. I waited for him to say it publicly, not in an email, not in a document that could be revised later, in a room, in front of witnesses. I knew that moment would come. People like Daniel can't resist clarity. They crave the performance of finality. The deal was nearing its close. Pressure was mounting. He wanted closure. So did I. The waiting wasn't about patience. It was about letting him choose the moment. And he did, all on his own. The meeting was framed as alignment. An all hands, mandatory attendance. Calendar blocked weeks in advance. Daniel liked moments like this. Rooms where attention gathered naturally, where authority didn't need to be asserted because it was already assumed. The space was glass-walled, transparent by design. Everyone could see in, everyone could see out. It was meant to signal openness. In practice, it functioned as a stage. People filled the room quietly, laptops closed, phones face down. Conversations softened into murmurs and then stopped entirely once Daniel entered. He stood at the front without notes. He never used notes. He spoke about progress, about momentum, about how close we were to something meaningful. He thanked the board for their confidence and the team for their flexibility. Flexibility had become his favorite word. He talked about focus, about the need to streamline, about how not every contribution could scale into the future he was describing. No one interrupted him. I stood near the back where the glass reflected the room back onto itself. Faces layered over faces, a company watching itself be addressed. Daniel's tone shifted slightly, not sharper, just slower. "This kind of growth requires difficult decisions," he said. "Clarity, commitment." He paused just long enough to make the room lean forward. Then he said my name. Not formally, not with acknowledgement, as if it were an item on a list. He spoke about resistance, about misalignment, about how some people confuse technical depth with leadership. He said I had been offered options, generous ones, that I had refused to move forward with the company's vision. That part wasn't true, but truth wasn't the point. He needed a contrast, someone to embody the old way so the new one could appear inevitable. Effective immediately, he said, we're making a change. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He looked relieved. The word terminated landed without echo. For cause. That phrase carries weight when it's spoken aloud. It implies justification without explanation. It closes the door to nuance. I didn't react. Not because I was stunned, because I had already heard this version of the story forming weeks earlier. Daniel continued speaking about the future, about confidence, about ownership. Then he said the sentence he didn't need to say. The company owns the technology, he told the room. We're protected. There it was. Not written, not implied. Spoken. In front of witnesses. I watched the faces around me change, almost imperceptibly. Some avoided my eyes. Others looked relieved it wasn't them. A few looked confused, unsure which version of events they were meant to remember later. No one spoke. Security appeared at the edge of the room, already briefed, already part of the choreography. Daniel gestured toward the door as if concluding a presentation. I picked up my bag. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't remind anyone of the years of work or the systems still running because I was there. None of that belonged in this moment. As I walked out, I felt the weight of the room behind me. Not hostility, not sympathy. Expectation. They were waiting for a reaction, something to validate the story they had just been told. I gave them none. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet for a company celebrating a near-finished deal. My footsteps sounded louder than they should have. When the elevator doors closed, the building didn't feel different. That was the strangest part. Nothing collapsed. No alarms went off. The system continued to function exactly as it had moments before. That's the danger of surface-level authority. It feels complete. It looks decisive, but it doesn't touch what's underneath. Daniel believed the meeting had ended the problem. In reality, it had documented it. What he called termination wasn't an ending. It was a trigger, and once triggered, the process no longer required my presence. Only time. The email didn't sound dramatic. It wasn't written to intimidate or persuade. There were no threats, no demands, no emotional language meant to provoke a response. It was a notice, clear, precise, unavoidable. It went out less than an hour after the meeting ended, sent by my attorney, addressed to the company's general counsel, copied to the board. No one called me before it was sent. There was nothing to discuss. The contract didn't require permission. It required conditions. And those conditions had been met. The subject line referenced a clause most people had never read beyond the heading, a provision designed for scenarios everyone assumes will never happen. License revocation. The body of the email was short enough that it couldn't be misunderstood. It cited the statements made during the meeting, the claim of ownership, the termination without cause, the material breach triggered by both. Then it outlined the consequence. 24 hours. That was it. No explanation of impact, no attempt to soften the message, no invitation to negotiate. The clock didn't start when anyone opened the email. It started when it was delivered. I didn't receive a copy. I didn't need one. My attorney confirmed the timestamp, and that was enough. From that moment on, the system was operating on borrowed time. I went home, not because I was exhausted, because there was nothing left to do. The city felt strangely normal. Traffic moved, people waited at crosswalks, restaurants filled for dinner. Inside the company, something had shifted. I knew that without seeing it. Revocation doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly in the background, changing the legal reality without disturbing the operational one. For a while, I made tea. I watched the evening settle in. I didn't check my phone. There was no advantage in monitoring panic. The first call came late, not from Daniel. From legal. The tone was careful, measured, as if volume might change the substance of the message. They wanted to talk, to clarify, to understand. I declined. Not rudely, not dramatically, just a simple statement through my attorney that all communication should remain in writing. That mattered, because writing creates record. The next call came from the board, someone who had never spoken to me directly before. suddenly concerned, suddenly aware of nuance. They suggested revisiting the termination, reframing it, adjusting the language. It was too late for that. The contract didn't care about reframing. It cared about actions already taken. The hours passed. Daniel called, then called again, then sent messages. I didn't respond. Silence at this stage wasn't strategy. It was process. The revocation wasn't leverage in the way people imagine leverage. It wasn't a threat to be wielded. It wasn't a bargaining chip. It was a state change. At the 24-hour mark, the license expired. Automatically. No announcement, no confirmation, no system-wide alert. Just a line crossed. From that moment on, the company was using technology it no longer had the right to operate. Every test run, every demo, every promise made to the buyer, all of it existed in violation. The system still ran. That's what made it dangerous. Unauthorized use doesn't fail loudly. It accumulates risk quietly. By the time the consequences arrive, there's no way to unwind them cleanly. That's when the calls became urgent. That's when Daniel's confidence cracked. But none of that required my attention yet, because the revocation wasn't the event. It was the condition. What mattered now was what happened next. And that wouldn't be decided by me. It would be decided by the people who had built an entire deal on an assumption that no longer existed. The first sign wasn't noise. It was hesitation. Meetings that had been scheduled weeks in advance were suddenly postponed. Emails that used to arrive with confident subject lines shifted tone, becoming careful, conditional. Words like final and confirmed disappeared. They were replaced with pending and under review. That change didn't come from inside the company. It came from outside. Due diligence has a rhythm. When things are clean, it moves quickly. Questions narrow. Conversations shorten. Lawyers stop circling and start closing. That rhythm broke. Requests multiplied instead of resolved. Clarifications led to more clarifications. The buyer's legal team began asking questions no one on Daniel's side could answer without referencing documents that no longer aligned with reality. Ownership, licensing, continuity. Simple questions, expensive answers. The assumption that had carried the deal forward for months was suddenly the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. Daniel tried to control the narrative. He reassured the board. He reframed the issue as a misunderstanding, a technicality, a disgruntled founder creating friction during a sensitive moment. That explanation worked internally. It didn't work externally. Buyers don't evaluate confidence. They evaluate exposure. The moment the revocation surfaced in the data room, the conversation changed completely. Lawyers don't debate tone. They debate enforceability. And enforceability doesn't bend. The buyer's counsel asked for confirmation, not interpretation, not reassurance. Confirmation. There wasn't any to give. Behind closed doors, the deal slowed to a crawl. Financial projections were revisited. Risk assessments expanded. The clean story Daniel had worked so hard to construct began to fracture under scrutiny. Not dramatically, methodically. Each unanswered question widened the gap between valuation and reality. The board grew restless. They had trusted Daniel to simplify complexity, not manufacture uncertainty. They had accepted his confidence as a substitute for diligence. Now that confidence was being audited, Daniel pushed harder. He called emergency meetings, pressured legal, suggested workarounds, temporary extensions, anything that sounded like progress. But progress requires permission, and permission no longer existed. The buyer paused the process. Not canceled, paused. That distinction mattered. Pauses invite scrutiny. They signal doubt without committing to loss. They allow time for reassessment. And reassessment, in this case, led to one conclusion. Without an enforceable license, there was no asset. Just infrastructure, just staff, just a shell built around something it no longer controlled. Daniel argued that the system still worked, that the code existed, that the company could continue without disruption. The buyer's counsel disagreed. Functionality without rights isn't value, it's liability. The longer the pause lasted, the more visible the problem became. Rumors reached the staff. Confidence wavered. People started asking questions that hadn't mattered before. What exactly are we selling? Who owns it? What happens if this doesn't close? Daniel stopped answering openly. That was new. He had always filled silence with certainty. Now he filled it with urgency. Calls went unanswered. Messages stacked up. The tone shifted from persuasive to desperate. By the time the buyer formally withdrew, the outcome felt inevitable. The announcement was brief, professional, carefully worded. They cited unresolved IP concerns, inability to proceed under current conditions, a decision to reallocate capital elsewhere. No accusations, no blame, just withdrawal. The deal didn't explode. It evaporated. Inside the company, the effect was immediate. Valuations collapsed. Momentum reversed. The confidence that had held everything together dissolved almost overnight. Daniel didn't address the staff. He couldn't. The story he had built no longer had a center. The board convened without him. And for the first time since he arrived, Daniel wasn't the one setting the agenda. The collapse wasn't loud. It was administrative. And that made it final. Boards don't panic. They recalibrate. That's the difference between authority and confidence. Confidence reacts. Authority adjusts the frame and pretends it was always heading there. The meeting wasn't announced. No agenda circulated. No calendar block appeared with a reassuring title. It simply happened. Closed doors, restricted attendance, phones left outside the room. Daniel wasn't invited. That alone said more than any statement ever could. Up until that point, he had been the conduit, the translator between ambition and approval, the one who made uncertainty sound like opportunity. Now, uncertainty had turned inward. The questions were no longer abstract, they were personal. Who approved the language in the deck? Who confirmed ownership? Who authorized termination under those conditions? Questions boards ask only when they are already done trusting. Daniel was asked to provide a written explanation. Not a presentation, not a defense, an explanation. Those rarely go well. The board reviewed timelines, emails, statements. The sequence of decisions that had felt so efficient at the time now appeared compressed, reckless. What Daniel had framed as simplification began to look like omission. Not malicious, just negligent. That distinction matters legally. It doesn't matter reputationally. The board's concern wasn't me. It was exposure, shareholder liability, regulatory scrutiny, the possibility that more assumptions were buried beneath the surface, waiting to surface at the worst possible moment. Daniel was no longer the solution. He was the variable. When he was finally brought into the room, the tone had shifted. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just distance. They asked him to walk through the decision to terminate me, to explain why ownership had been asserted publicly, to clarify what due diligence had been performed before making those claims. He answered confidently, too confidently. He spoke the way people do when they believe conviction can replace documentation. When they assume certainty will fill in the gaps, evidence leaves behind. It didn't. One board member interrupted him, not sharply, calmly. "You told us the IP was secure," they said. "On what basis?" Daniel paused. That pause mattered. He referenced advisors, counsel, industry norms. None of those were contracts. Another board member asked a simpler question. "Did you read the license?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Silence returned to the room, not the kind he liked. This one didn't need translation. By the end of the meeting, no one argued. They didn't need to. The board voted to remove him from operational control pending investigation, not as punishment, as containment. Language matters in moments like that. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't protest. He looked stunned, not angry, not betrayed, unprepared. He had mistaken momentum for insulation. The announcement to staff was brief, carefully neutral. Leadership changes, interim oversight, commitment to stability. No mention of blame, no mention of me. That part came later, through channels that didn't require press releases. The board reached out indirectly, through counsel, through intermediaries. They didn't apologize. Boards rarely do. They acknowledged a breakdown, expressed interest in resolution, asked what it would take to restore viability. They spoke in terms of options. I listened. Not because I wanted to return, because I wanted to understand whether they finally understood. What they offered wasn't control. It was reversal, undoing decisions, reframing narratives, attempting to put the system back where it had been. That wasn't possible. Not because I was unwilling, because the conditions that had allowed trust to exist were gone. The board removed Daniel to stop the bleeding, but they couldn't undo the incision. Power had shifted, not through confrontation, but through consequence. The room had changed hands without anyone raising their voice. That's how reversals actually happen. Quietly, administratively, too late to feel dramatic. By the time the board finished recalibrating, the question was no longer whether Daniel had failed. It was whether the company could continue at all. And that question didn't require an answer from them. It required acceptance. After everything recalibrated, there was a period of quiet that felt unfamiliar. Not relief, not victory, just absence. The emails slowed. The calls stopped coming in waves and began arriving one at a time, carefully worded, cautious. The urgency had burned itself out, replaced by something closer to resignation. The company still existed. Offices were still open. Systems still ran for now. But the center was gone. When people talk about collapse, they imagine destruction, something visible, loud, public. This wasn't that. This was hollowing. The board finalized its decisions without ceremony. Interim leadership, external reviews, statements crafted to reassure people who no longer believed reassurance meant anything. Daniel's name faded quickly, not because anyone defended him, but because no one needed to mention him anymore. He had served his function, then become a liability, then disappeared from relevance. That's how organizations metabolize failure. I didn't return to the building. I didn't need to. What mattered wasn't location. It was ownership. The license remained revoked. The system continued to exist, but it was no longer theirs to evolve, extend, or sell. Without updates, without calibration, it would slowly drift. Not immediately, not catastrophically, just enough to matter. That's the thing about complex systems. They don't punish neglect instantly. They reveal it over time. The board proposed solutions. Reinstatement, advisory roles, revised equity, language softened, tone shifted. They weren't wrong to try. They were just late. I declined politely, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. The conditions that made the work meaningful were gone. Trust, once treated as optional, doesn't regenerate on demand. What I took back wasn't just technology. It was authorship. The right to decide how something evolves, what constraints matter, when to stop, when not to scale. Those decisions don't fit neatly into pitch decks. They never have. In the weeks that followed, the company downsized quietly. Teams thinned. Ambitions contracted. The story that had once been told with such certainty was replaced by careful phrasing and reduced expectations. People moved on. They always do. I kept working, not on salvaging what was left, but on understanding what had been learned. That power doesn't always sit where it's most visible. That confidence often outruns comprehension. That silence, when chosen deliberately, can carry more weight than resistance ever could. Nothing about this felt like winning. Winning implies opposition, celebration, an audience. This felt like alignment restored. The system back where it belonged. The narrative stripped of its urgency. The noise gone. What remained wasn't triumph. It was structure. And structure, unlike authority, doesn't need to announce itself to function. People ask sometimes what the moment felt like, the one where everything turned. I tell them it didn't feel like anything. That's how you know it was real. By the time the consequences arrived, the decision had already been made, quietly, precisely, long before anyone noticed. That's what remains when the room empties. Not the voice that spoke the loudest, but the framework that still holds when everyone else has left.